QSO Today, episode 335, Clint Turner, KA7OEI. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you in this new year to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver, now shipping from your favorite amateur radio dealer. I appreciate ICOM's continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for KA7OEI, your host. Flex Radio is a platinum sponsor of the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo that will return in March 2021. Early bird tickets are now on sale at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo website. We have an exciting lineup of speakers in the next expo, and we are still building the presentation tracks. AMSAT alone has at least 9 out of the over 60 presentations coming in the new expo. Our new AirMeet platform for the auditorium will be a crowd pleaser, as you will actually be able to see and feel the crowd. I can't wait. Please check out the link in this week's show notes page for more information about the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. Clint Turner, KA7OEI, is an experimenter, builder, and operator on all bands and modes. He shares his background in microwave communications, EME or Moonbounce, and his involvement in the Northern Utah Web SDR project, an amazing online resource for hams who want to listen to all of the low bands with a waterfall display at the same time. KA7OEI is my QSO Today. KA7OEI, this is Eric for KA7OEI. Are you there, Clint?
I am here, Eric.
Clint, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story?
Well, my ham radio story goes back almost as long as I can remember. I do not really remember not knowing about ham radio to some extent. My parents are both technical types. My dad's an engineer, material science engineer. My mom was a nurse. But my mom, when she was in her early teens and late, aughts, she lived with her stepfather and family in the remote islands of the Mariana Chain, and there's nothing to do, not even school. So she hung around the Navy comm shack and learned code at, 50 words a minute or something, because that was the most interesting thing on the island. So when my dad had this portable shortwave radio he would bring out occasionally, I was fascinated by it. It's an old French Solinor radio. And occasionally I would ask to listen to the French radio, and I'd hear these weird distorted sounds. And I was told that it was ham radio. I never could understand what they were saying because I had no BFO. But that fascinated me from the earliest stage I can remember, hearing stations from all over the world, hearing CHU and WWV and HCJB. And even to this day, I still cannot get over the magic when I listen to signals just wing their way across the ionosphere. I mean, it's just cool to me.
So you have this early interest, a natural interest.
Right.
But how did it congeal into the direction that it's taking you today? How did you actually get the first license?
I'd considered getting a ham license forever, but it wasn't until I was about 13 or 14. And I had a neighbor just across the street and up one, Fred Dixon, silent key now, KA7OEI. And he was a retired civil engineer, and he had the obvious vertical and ground plane on his back patio. And a nice guy, and I pestered him for a year or two, and I finally convinced him, how about giving me the novice test? You ever done that? And he had not done that, but he was willing. And so in the summer of 1982, the envelope came, we sat down, and I did the novice test the old-fashioned way. And I got on August 13th, a Friday in 1982, when I was 14, I got the call I have now. I've thought about upgrading it, but these days, the only way you see a KA7 call is probably because they're a novice, and that's getting increasingly rare.
That's one of the reasons I keep my WA6.
Yes.
Because for some reason, new hams don't want the WAs or the WBs, right?
Right.
Okay, so you have this novice license. What's the first rig?
I am one of the youngest people that I've ever run across that did it the, quote, old-fashioned way. I've been building electronic stuff before then, and I thought, well, I can just use my Heathkit SW717 receiver and build a transmitter. So I did that. I discovered the Heathkit was totally inadequate, but my Elmer had a second-hand SB303 Heathkit. And I built the 5-band 50-watter that appears in the 1970 ARRL handbook, because it was in the junior high school library. And my dad, having worked at CTS Nights in the 60s, had a whole box of crystals. And I discovered some of them, when doubled, could kind of go somewhere in the 40-meter handband. So I was a traditional, for the rock-bound novice with 50 watts for the first mostly a year that I was on the radio, which these days seems almost impossible to conceive. But, I was a teenager with no money and managed to build something that worked and managed not to get killed in the process of working with high voltage.
Now, we're going to go through some of the other projects that you've had since then, but it appears to me that you actually have some handy skill, the ability to fabricate things more than just electronics. Did you have a shop in your house? Was your father a hands-on kind of guy?
Pretty much. I always was interested when he worked on the TV, or when he worked on the car or helped around the house. So I was never been afraid of doing things. And more importantly, I was never afraid of doing things and failing, because like a lot of people, you learn more by failing and then figuring out what you did wrong than you ever do by succeeding the first time. So it was no stranger to me to grab the drill and a file and just work at it until it got done. I really never had any fancy tools or even test equipment, so I kind of had to wing it. Even later, before I got some tools, or before they were available nowadays, I learned to just use voltmeters and just diodes and homemade frequency counters to get things kind of close, and then cross my fingers that I wouldn't get a pink slip in the mail at some point when I put it on the air. But it must have worked. I never got anything like that.
You say that your call sign was and still is KA7OEI. What was the hometown, and where was it that you were growing up?
When I got my license, I lived here in Utah, again, in Bountiful, Utah. And there's a fairly decent ham community around. When I was a teenager, it's hard to interact because you can't drive. On the air, getting on the CW nets, and when I got on 2 meters, fairly close-knit amateur radio club, and there's a lot more of them now. But a lot of friendly people willing to give their time.
So did you take advantage of that? Did you become a club member?
Oh, yes. I've been a member of the Utah Amateur Radio Club for many years, and in fact was the president for 5 years, which brings another thing to mind, is that, as you've noticed, it's sometimes hard to get people involved in doing club leadership. But I guess we can touch on that later.
We can mention it now. I always felt the reason that nobody wanted to do club leadership was because the first half hour of every club meeting was the club business, which, if you were a kid, I'd rather be shot and put to sleep.
Been very careful. We tried to keep it, you say a half hour is about right. We try to keep it to 20 minutes, but we always try to have an engaging meeting after that. And hopefully people wander in by then and are interested. Finding topics that everyone's interested in is always a fight.
You describe yourself as a home brewer, that would seem to me, and you have this novice license. When did you upgrade?
I upgraded less than a year later. The FCC still came to town at that time, so I got the Radio Shack book, 5 watts to 1,000 watts, that I think a lot of people had, which was out of date by that time. And I had a 1982 Radio Amateur's Handbook, which I still have, with a lot of outlining in it. Went in and took the general, and then the examiner pointed out, well, why don't you just take the advanced? I had not studied for it, and I got barely enough to pass it, so I walked in a novice and out an advanced class, and I held the advanced class for 20 or more years until I finally got to extra.
Were you a no-code extra, or were you a code extra?
I was a code extra. Well, I had to have the 13 to get the advanced, because that's the only way you could get an advanced. So I was a extra medium, as a friend of mine calls it, the 13 word a minute extra. So the paper upgrade. I tried for the 20 words and missed it by one question, but I'll be happy with what I got.
Now, this is a strange question because as we go through the interview, we'll find you have multiple operating modes that you like. But if we're going to talk about the traditional operating modes, what are the traditional operating modes that you like the most?
Occasionally CW, which I use almost exclusively besides digital when I get on some of the longer wave bands. And, just the sideband. I have not done FT8 yet, which seems odd, but it's fascinating, but I just haven't gotten around to doing it. When I get on the air, which is not as much as I'd like, it is a more or less traditional CW and sideband mode.
Now, anybody that's looked at your websites will know the answer to this question, it seems. Did ham radio and your interest in electronics, did it play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yeah, it did. I have always been a nerd. I'll admit to that readily. I mean, most of us probably have that gene to some effect, to some extent. And, that knack gene that Bill Mira talks about, I suppose, even from the earliest days of I found playing with a tube tester interesting, testing tubes. And I did go to school for a couple of years and working toward a engineering degree, but I never quite got it. I kind of got intercepted when I was a teenager. I had a job with an engineering company doing electronics and power systems engineering. And then later I got a job with a satellite teleport, which I had for many years, where I became chief engineer of that, making sure when I threw data up in the sky that at least some of it came back down. That was my job for a long time. And it turns out a lot of those referenced were gotten by knowing somebody, because I was a ham operator. My boss during that time was still a good friend, and a ham operator and one of my mentors.
Well, what I see from your website, and I'll make a reference to it in the show notes page, is that you have this amazing ability to document.
Oh, yes.
And I think actually that it almost looks like technical writing background, but it also looks like a research. You've done advanced research and you learned how to keep a lab journal, and therefore you put it into writing on web pages.
When I started doing that, I did it for my own benefit, because you probably saw before we started the show, my shack is rather cluttered. So if I write something on a piece of paper, it might as well be gone. So I scribble it down and then put it on the web, not only for me to see, but for everyone to see. And I often find myself referring to things I put on the web as well. One good example, too, is I don't know if you ran across it, built a synchronous voting repeater system a couple of years ago. And that is all documented on the web, where we can, as club members, can find it, because we have gone to the radio site and forgot the paperwork, but we had a phone and we could bring up diagrams and knew how to align something that we needed to take care of. So that's become very handy. And it's just become a habit, taking pictures. And it's fun to find people that are like-minded who stumble across the web with similar interest. And there's fewer better ways to do that than putting it where people can find it.
Why not do a wiki? I'll let you explain what a wiki is versus a regular static web page.
I just haven't gotten around to doing a wiki, which would be an interactive sort of, I wouldn't say a database, but, like Wikipedia, just an interactive system of articles. I just never got around to that. Just the blog seems adequate. I updated the blog more recently than my original web page. But it just, when I make a change, I'll add a new blog entry or just update the article. I just haven't done it that way.
Do you get comments on the blog, or do people send you emails and then you'll update from the comments?
Both, actually.
On your website, you have a whole lot of information about microwave projects. And I wouldn't think that a guy in Bountiful, Utah would really be into microwave, because it seems like to me that there wouldn't be a lot of people that were doing microwave. But how did you get involved in microwave, and what started that off?
Well, I kind of propagated when I became a ham to doing things that fewer people seemed to be interested in, because, just getting on the air, plugging in the radio and talking was less of an appeal to me. So at the time I got licensed and did a lot of those microwave projects. It was harder to find a kit or transverter to do something. So, and also being a bit on the cheap, and also being more interested in learning about it, I would just accumulate components like my 10 gig microwave transverter, which you've seen on the page. It's still in the other room on a piece of plywood with wires going everywhere. It's inconvenient, but it works and stable, and it makes contacts. Who else do I talk to here in Utah? Well, believe it or not, there has been a group of sort of diehards of similar vein. A lot of people buy their equipment, some of them make it, and there's always been someone to talk to. But when you start getting into more exotic stuff, like 24 gig is kind of exotic, or even some of the light wave stuff that I've done, you kind of have to bring your own gear to the party, because after all, what ham radio is less interesting if you're just out there talking to yourself.
That's true, but on 24 gigahertz, it seems to me that you narrow the field even further.
Absolutely. Unlike Southern California, where you have to find an empty spot on some of the peaks during the microwave contest, we actually have to range our QSOs and everything like that, because there's a handful of people here who can get on 24 gig sideband. Doesn't stop us from making contacts and proving our gear works before we're putting it away till the next contest. But it is I find it just fascinating just to see what we can get away with, with micro power. My 24 gig transverter is probably like half a milliwatt, but with a dish, and you can go 15 miles or something like that, a foot dish. So, and if the other guy has a bigger dish, let him do all the work.
I've heard that about EME as well, Moonbounce.
Yes.
You can do very well with 24 elements, say on VHF, as long as the guy at the other end has the 30-meter dish in his yard.
That is right. Years ago, I belonged to a ham club who'd set up an EME station on 2 meters. And there was no shortage of people in Europe with big, huge arrays that allowed us to talk to them. These days, with some of the WSJT modes, it's all the easier to do. One of the projects that I haven't documented much yet is a friend and I are putting together a 23 centimeter EME station, half a kilowatt, which we hope to have on the air in the next year or so. And running high power on that band should be a lot of fun. And we should have a medium class station, so we should be able to talk to some of the smaller guys, we hope.
And now this message from ICOM America. ICOM wants to wish you a very happy 2021. This happiness should include hours of fun and enjoyment with the new ICOM IC705 portable transceiver. The ICOM IC705 is the perfect sidekick for amateurs that enjoy operating any mode both indoors and outdoors. It is the perfect QRP companion with base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in just over 2 pounds. The ICOM IC705 has RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. Its other features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live bandscope and waterfall display, 5 watts out with a BP272 battery pack, or 10 watts with a 13.8 volts DC from an external power source. Operating modes include single sideband CW, AM, FM, digital modes, as well as full D-Star functions, a micro USB connector, Bluetooth, wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot. The HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment and included in the box. The IC705 supports QRP and QRPP operations. And the perfect accessory for the IC705 is now available in the LC192 optional backpack that includes a special compartment for your IC705, with room for accessories for soda activation or a day's social distancing in the park. Of course, there is a huge list of available accessories, including cables, batteries, and software listed on the ICOM IC705 website. Folks, this is a fine rig, with many available positive online reviews. It will become the de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operators, and since it now has the RS-BA1 IP-based remote control software, the IC705 will be the first choice as a remote-based rig. You owe it to yourself to make the ICOM IC705 your transceiver of choice for the new year. Be sure to click on the banner ad in this week's show notes page for more information on this amazing rig. But once you do that, be sure to call your favorite ICOM dealer to place your order. The ICOM IC705 is in stock and shipping today. And when you do that, please be sure to tell your dealer that you heard it here on QSO Today. Thanks as always to ICOM for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Be sure to visit www.icomamerica.com/amateur for more information on other ICOM radios as well. And now back to our QSO. If you were going to give advice to a ham that wants to do what you're doing, what would you say should be the first project to get started on microwave? Would you send them to 10 gigahertz first?
Probably. The 10 gigahertz, well, in the old days, the go-to thing was to get some gun transceivers or some of those door openers. Those are harder to find. 10 gig transverter is pretty easy to come up with. I think what Down East Microwave and those like have them. That's an awful lot of fun and fairly easy to do. So I would probably do that. But I would have to find out what they were really interested in and how much time they were interested in spending it, because, it's one of those rabbit holes you can go down without realizing it until it's too late. Then before too long, you're surrounded by microwave stuff.
Could you use a 10 gigahertz LNB and then into a software-defined radio?
Yes, you could. They're not available for sale readily here in the U.S., but in Europe and other parts of the world where the satellite band is different than here, you can actually use one of those for external locking and receive 10 gig narrowband. I've never done it because LNBs are hard to get here in this part of the world. But there's a number of articles from some British guys that have done that.
This is what they're doing for the S-Hale Q100 satellite.
Yeah, unfortunately we don't have that here like you do, but which looks like an awful lot of fun.
Well, hopefully I'll get mine working and I'll make it available online.
Yes.
So you have a number of other microwave projects which I thought were interesting in looking at your website. And one of those was a beacon project that you call the Ct Medford Beacon.
Oh, that's not microwave, but that's a Part 15. My interests have ranged from light wave down to very low frequency. A friend of mine once stated that hams are given so many cycles in their lifetime, and some people waste them on the microwave bands. I've kind of wasted them badly on light wave and kind of repented on the low frequency bands. So the Medford Beacon is part of Part 15, where you're allowed to put up in the AM broadcast band 100 milliwatts on a 3-meter antenna, and running QRSS or slow CW in PSK31, that legal 100 milliwatt has been copied all over the western United States. And even lower frequency still in the 160 to 190 kilohertz range, you're allowed 1 watt with a 15-meter antenna. When I was a teenager and later, I dabbled on that. And these days we actually have ham bands down there. That was a nice fit.
What did you play? Did you play your favorite music so you could drive around the neighborhood with your beacon, or did you just send Morse code? Or
I built it so I could do that, but I usually used it for propagation. I actually had the beacon running during the eclipse a couple years ago just to see if temporary darkness path would affect propagation. Looked like it did a little bit, but it wasn't scientific enough to draw conclusions. But I fire that up once in a while, and it's amazing how far it gets out. I mean, it just proves Shannon's law, given slow enough information rate and an enough bandwidth, you can send anything with a very low signal-to-noise ratio.
So Shannon's law could be the basis for WSJT, for example, right?
It absolutely is. Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you have done free space optical communications.
Yes.
Which is where you've spent a lot of cycles, assuming.
Yes, I've wasted my cycles there.
I remember that originally that was done, maybe originally it wasn't done, because historically I guess it goes all the way back to the turn of the century, of the last century, But originally, from a commercial standpoint, it seemed like that was done with lasers. But in reading one of the papers that you put up on the internet, it looks like you've actually had success with LEDs and not lasers. Could you talk a little bit about your time in free space optical and how that works for you? And you sent me a great picture, by the way.
Actually, Alexander Graham Bell considered his greatest invention not to be the telephone, but the photophone. So in 1870s, he was doing free space optical communications. So that was the first voice that was transmitted wirelessly. But traditionally, people have assumed lasers were the only way to go. And for practical reasons, until maybe about 15 years ago, that might have been a reasonable assumption because you could not get a lot of light output from a solid-state device or anything other than a laser. But with the multi-watt LEDs, Chris Long, VK3AML, and Dr. Mike Groth, VK7MJ in Australia, as you can imagine, produced a paper where they had gone across most of the breadth of Tasmania, about 116 or so miles, using LEDs. And so I got in touch with Chris. Here in Utah, we are blessed with unique geography. It's the basin and range geography, which means there's a lot of desert with mountains sticking out of it randomly. And I did a bit of poring over maps and discovered there was another path, 173 miles, which is about 279 kilometers between two mountains that were both easily accessible. So I worked toward building LED-based gear, came up with a different type of detector than was normally available using a photodiode and a JFET, and got another 10-15 dB of sensitivity out of what had been possible before. And with 3 watts of LED, managed to span that distance back in 2007. It was both CW and voice. On my webpage, you can hear how weak the signals really were because seeing conditions weren't ideal. But we definitely did it, and it was two-way. Two-way CW and one-way voice, because for reasons that I never did figure out, one of our transmitters or receivers is slightly more capable than the other.
Now, is there an organization in the United States or worldwide of hams that are doing optical communications?
Not really. There's a couple of Yahoo groups that haven't seen much activity recently. It's one of those things where the activity seems to come and go, sort of ebb and flow like the tides. After we did this optical communications, there were actually a couple of groups in Great Britain that were doing it readily. Now I do get occasional email from some Canadian hams or for various parts of the world who do things, a shorter distance, which is understandable because, not everywhere is desert with random mountains sticking up. But it still happens, and I do get email about it, and I'm happy to answer questions to anyone who would ask. That's the reason why I put this stuff on the webpage.
Now, do you think that from your studies, these communications paths were open at night?
Yeah, the sun is a very strong radiator.
Noise generator.
Oh, absolutely. It's a good noise generator. Having said that, I have done optical paths over a few tens of miles in daylight, but we could probably not do the 100-mile path easily in daylight without some really exotic materials, like dichroic lenses and narrower band emitters.
And is there any future to this? Do you have any future projects on the optical side, or do you think that you've done as much optical as you think that you can do at this point?
It's probably the latter. What would be nice is if we could run more data across it. But one of the issues you have is you need so much energy. This is coming back to Shannon's law. You need a certain amount of energy to transmit a bit, just to do it over the noise. And anything practical ran the numbers. You could not run, 100 megabits or gigabit over 100 some odd mile optical path without really having things you'd have to call the FAA about. I do have some ideas. I do have a longer path in mind that would push it over 190 miles, but that'll take quite a production, camping at altitude and all these other things, and haven't gotten around to doing that. It's still in the background. The other thing too is that it requires willing participants as well, because when we did the long distance light wave stuff, there was a whole group that went to the south end carrying gear. I could just drive up to where I was, but they had to climb up a mountain, and there's 3 people with backpacks carrying gear. And this would even be worse than that, staying overnight at 11,000 feet in the mountain, in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere. So that'll take a lot more of a production than what we've done.
You sent me some pictures of you hiking, and on the strap of your backpack is a radio, and it didn't look like a ham radio. So you do a fair amount of backpacking, I think, on your own. What are you carrying there?
That's actually a Yaesu FT530. It's radio from the mid-90s. It's just my go-to radio. Does about everything. It's a dual-band analog radio that does everything I want to do, including when I'm backpacking, wakes me up because it has an alarm clock in it. So it's it's an oldie but a goodie.
And do you carry any other kind of a device like a Jarman or some satellite radio or something like that?
Yeah, I have a GPS receiver with me. And on some of the backpacking trips, I'd done most of my backpacking in the desert of Utah, like Canyonlands National Park. And I've been known on most occasions to take a QRP CW radio with me. And occasionally we're able to get up a good enough antenna in the narrow rock canyons to make a few QSOs, which is also great to do.
What is the QRP radio that you take?
I have 2 of them. I have the ATS-3A, which is KD1JV's kit radio, and also I have an old Small Wonder Labs DSW-40. Both of those are excellent portable radios to take along with you, 3 to 5 watts.
And what's the antenna of choice when you're backpacking into the Canyonlands?
I've tried all sorts of things. Need an end-fed half wave and a dipole. Both seem to work equally badly, in the sense that, in the desert there aren't very many trees, so it's hard to get something high unless you can get on top of a cliff and throw something off. I'm still looking for the ideal high-gain portable antenna that weighs nothing. If you know of one, let me know.
So a magnetic loop actually weighs quite a lot if you were taking something like an Alex loop or something like that.
Right, and it probably wouldn't do as well as a wire on maybe 40 meters would do okay, but no, I'm not interested in carrying a loop with me backpacking. 100 feet of wire weighs, a few ounces for skinny wire, and one hopes one could do something with that.
Well, I think that anybody and I'm not a backpacker, but I think I can sympathize that probably the more miles you go, every kilogram that you're carrying feels like a bigger rock.
Yes, years ago we did a week-long trip into the Wind River Range of Wyoming, and we spent all our time at 11,000 feet. And we had good success there, but some nights we were just too bushed to put up any kind of antenna. Just lay in the tent, avoid the mosquitoes, and recoup from the day's hiking.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO Today. What is the Northern Utah Web SDR project, and what is your involvement in it?
The Northern Utah Web SDR uses the excellent software by Dr. DeBoer, PA3FWM, and it allows multiple people to connect to the same resource, which would be, in the case of the Northern Utah Web SDR, another local amateur got in touch with the landlord who had on his property an abandoned HF array that had been used for propagation research in the past. And there's a omnidirectional log periodic vertical antenna, which is the main antenna, and also a log periodic beam antenna pointed east. And it's in a relatively quiet location. And by leveraging that, people can, hundreds of people literally could connect to those low noise antenna receivers and each get their own private virtual receiver that they can tune around, adjust their bandwidth and whatnot. And that allows remote reception for people, especially who might have a compromised receive capability, say due to local power line noise, or maybe just the difference in geography. Perhaps like on 40 meters, a chronic problem is if you're within 250 miles of the station you're trying to talk to, you probably won't hear them. So people in California use it a lot, and consequently people in Utah use a California WebSDR a lot. My involvement was almost from the beginning. A group of about a half a dozen of us put our heads together and decided that the best common good for amateur radio would be to make this resource available to as many people as possible. So we managed to get wireless internet into the location, which is kind of in the edge of the Great Salt Lake. I built a lot of RF filtering and lightning protection gear, and we rehabbed some of the antennas and put together some servers. And now it's there for everyone to use. If you go to sdrutah.org, you will see the 4 servers we currently have, which cover all the ham bands from 2,200 meters through 2 meters. And anyone can listen to what's going on, yes.
I was playing with it today, listening to 40 meter. There's a lot of 40 meter nets in the morning, apparently.
Yeah, it's heavily used by nets. And one of the questions I was wondering about was, up until fairly recently, the upper bands have been mostly useless. I mean, nets occur on the frequencies that are most reliable. But I was wondering that as the bands were opening, would the users on the lower frequencies just move up to the higher frequencies? The answer seems to be no. More and more people seem to be going there. New people seem to be going there when the upper bands open rather than the people that have been hanging out in the lower bands, which gives me hope that people are still interested in the HF bands and what they can do even in old-fashioned CW and voice modes.
Well, what I really liked about the Northern Utah WebSDR project website is that I could look at all the bands at the same time. At least from Utah, you could actually see what bands are open and which bands are closed.
Right, and it's if you go to websdr.org, you'll see the list and map of all of those known WebSDRs in the world. Also, less known at Northern Utah, we have the Kiwi SDR network as well. The Kiwi SDR is sort of a miniature WebSDR. It can only handle maybe a handful of users at once, but you can tune everywhere from essentially audio to 30 meg on those. We have those set aside if you want to just listen around on the bands that aren't covered by the WebSDR. And they also offer a few features like being able to do time difference of arrival. So we've used it a few times. Like, for example, on my blog recently, I noticed a big signal at the top end of 20 meters. And with a Kiwi TDOA network, I was able to determine that it was probably some high-frequency trading transmissions out of the Chicago area, clobbering the top portion of 20 meters. It's amazing that you can do something like that. Click a few buttons and figure out where a transmission's coming from.
Now, with the Northern Utah WebSDR project, I actually saw the block diagrams that you have online. You've actually built filters for the bands themselves in front of those SDR receivers. So that means that you can't really go out of band too far without significant loss.
When I designed the WebSDR RF infrastructure, I figured in the future there would be receivers that could tune everywhere. And with the Kiwis, that's true. Most of the bands, which are essentially sound cards with soft rock receivers in front of them, which gives you 16 bits, which is better than you get from like an ICOM IC7300 to some extent. We have really good performance. In the future, I expect to find hardware that will allow us to tune everywhere, and we have this other RF path with less filtering for that. Of course, one of the realities of the world is that you can have a really weak ham signal, but right next to it, say on 40 meters, is a signal that's practically enough to light up an LED if you hook across an antenna. People in Europe have it way worse than we do here in North America. So what do you do about those bands? I mean, 16 bits of A to D on a radio is not enough to save you in that case. So it'll be interesting going forward on these really wideband receivers, what we can do to deal with the practical dynamics of the massively strong signals next to signals that are right at the noise.
You also did a presentation for your radio club. So I was looking at that. I'm thinking one of the things that you did is you designed all these filters, you integrated the whole thing together. The desert seems like a notorious place for lightning issues. And I was wondering, was there something that you learned at the beginning in terms of thinking about lightning protection at the beginning and then implementing it, and then what you've learned since then? You've obviously had a few lightning storms since then. What have you learned about lightning protection out there on the desert?
The rule of thumb on any lightning protection is that if you can only do one thing, ground the shield of the coax, close to the ground before it enters the building. Amazingly enough, we've only had one instance of lightning damage, and it was my fault. I didn't have enough protection on an MMIC, which I used to amplify some of the higher bands. But, threw a few diodes in there, learned my lesson, and it's withstood some pretty severe lightning storms since then. Good grounding and just having spare parts on hand is what I can recommend. The antennas themselves were professionally installed, and same reason they appear to have been hit or near. We see burn marks on them, and they seem to have survived. So a lot of the work was done for us. If you do one thing at your ham station, make sure it's grounded well before it comes into the building.
Is there a ground radial field under those antennas out there?
No, neither antenna actually requires a ground plane. Having said that, the ground is fairly conductive. It's on the edge of the Great Salt Lake, so the soil has fairly high conductivity, at least when it's wet. But none of the antennas require ground, which makes them, I guess, more predictable in their performance. We don't see really any change between when it's wet and when it's dry, and it's usually dry out here.
Well, what's amazing is looking at the waterfall display and not seeing any noise on the displays.
Well, we do get noise. There's some power lines that feed a pipeline compressor station not too far away. And one of the unfortunate side effects of living near the Great Salt Lake is there's vast plains of exposed dirt that are salty. And we get windstorms that whip that into the air. Then it rains. So we literally end up with conductive mud covering everything. We haven't had a good rain this year to wash everything off, so there's a few places where it's starting to get noisy. At some point, we'll have to walk the power line with DF gear and make a note of the bad and noisy insulators and report them to the power company. We did that a couple of years ago, and I think it's time to do it again.
Yeah, we do that here. We get sandstorms from the Sahara Desert that turn the air orange here, and it all crests on top of the power lines, and then we have power line noise like you wouldn't believe until we have a rain.
I would believe it. We get that here. We even get pole fires occasionally.
I always say this, Jews pray for rain for water to drink, and hams pray for rain for a clear, nice, clean band.
Oh, that's a good one.
At least that's what we do here.
Right.
So we need both the rain for the water, and we need the rain for amateur radio to work great on the HF bands. I'm curious, though, Clint, now that you have this, or the Northern Utah Web SDR project has this real estate with this antenna on it, do you notice when you're traveling across the deserts of the Southwest, perhaps, that there might be other tracts of land available or other abandoned radio receive places where these web SDRs could be relocated? Do you notice them more?
Well, being a ham, you always look up. I mean, you probably heard the anecdote where the neighbor didn't realize that somebody had an antenna on the roof until it was pointed out. So I have always looked up on the ground looking for antennas, looking for another site to place it like that. Maybe. One of the things about the web SDRs or remote receivers like that is placing them far enough apart, because you don't want too many too close together because they'll hear the same thing. It seems like 500-600 miles is a good distance to place them, because that gets you out of the local range on 40 and 80 meters, so that the locals can use the next one in 1-2 states over and get good results. One of the things that I would hope people would use a web SDR for, besides aiding them in their QSOs on the air, is to improve their own amateur radio station, because they can hear what the bands really sound like, and hopefully gives them hope to find out and reduce local noise sources that they may have that be reducing their reception. And also, knowing what your own transmitter sounds like, you can make a recording of yourself and listen to it later. If somebody says, this antenna works better than the other one, or your audio sounds bad or sounds weird, you can find out for yourself. On several web SDRs or Kiwi SDRs, you can bring up graphs to show what antenna A looks like compared to antenna B. You probably noticed from my blog there's a lot of entries on reducing noise at one's house, power line type noise, and I am of the firm opinion that most noise begins at home. If you have a noise problem, it's probably something in your own house, which should give people hope that if they have a bad situation now, they can make it better with a bit of inspiration from what they hear on other receive systems.
What is your first tool of choice if you're trying to reduce the noise in your house?
I have a portable shortwave receiver that I can walk around with, and turning the breakers on and off. And one should never forget, I've run across this a time or two, and somebody turned off their breakers and said, the noise didn't go away. Well, do you have computers running on a UPS? Oh, yeah. And that was what was doing it. So the portable shortwave receiver, even a cheap one, is a really, really good choice. I have a $15 one that is the first thing I grab. I haven't done much with it yet, but I also got one of those $50 spectrum analyzers that, the size of a nano VNA that I'm starting to walk around with to see what new noises have shown up in my house that I haven't noticed yet. There's always something.
Would you replace wall warts, switching power supplies with maybe combine all your wall warts into one heavy-duty switching supply so that you can at least know that all of the noise is in one box?
I've taken two approaches. In the ham shack, I try to minimize wall warts, or at least characterize them to see if they're quiet. And I've gone back to the old school transformer wall warts, which are a bit power hoggy. In certain cases, there are switching supplies that are kind of unique enough to it. And I've put them in boxes, sort of put them in jail so that all the leads going in and out go through filtering to make them completely quiet. And that's an absolutely foolproof way to do it, although it takes a lot of effort to do, but that is one way to do it.
I've actually cut off the switching supply off of all my cords and then tied them all to a commercial switching supply in a steel box.
Yes.
On the back of my desk, I've got different power supply voltages, and those have cables up to the iPhone or all the stuff that I'm trying to run.
Yes, that's a very good approach. Get a known good brand. It's amazing. You open a power supply that is noisy and discover that there are jumpers where all the filtering should be, and you see that all too often, and it makes me pull my hair out. But then again, it's cause for hope for the people with QRM at home that it's probably something they have.
What's interesting, I just had a couple of LED light bulbs that go out, and you think that an LED light bulb should last a lifetime, you would think, right? So I had a couple that went out, and I pulled them apart. Sure enough, their filter capacitor is missing, or at least there's places on the board where they should be. The primary transformer was burned out, so it must have taken a surge and it just burned up. But the LEDs were actually fine. So for anybody out there who's harvesting LEDs from bad light bulbs.
Right. Yeah, walk around with the LEDs seem to be more prone to cause VHF interference, but a friend of mine got an LED floodlight for his backyard and discovered HF totally went away. I put it on the Workbench and discovered it was sending 100 milliwatts of hash into the power line. You get what you pay for. You get what you pay for.
And it was also probably missing parts. I think the idea is that they take parts out until it stops working and then put the last one back in.
Yeah, so-called munching. You cut out parts until it quits working. Yeah, we joked that this light should have sent its own ID out. It should have been licensed.
So, Clint, what is the Lucky Dragon incident?
Oh, boy. You've done your research. As I mentioned, my mom lived in the Marianas, and we think around 1954 she was on the island of Truk, called Chuck now. From both her and separately from my late maternal grandmother, after some of the atomic tests around the Bikini Atoll, a day or so later, this boat limped in with a sick and dying crew member on it. And so far as we can tell, the only pictures that exist are the ones that my mom happened to take. My grandmother and my mom's stepdad went on the boat and saw equipment that was not likely to be used for fishing, as the boat was decked out to be. And then the way the story goes, within the day, the people and the boat were disappeared. And my brother has shown these pictures to friends of his in Japan, one of which happened to be one of those that was interested in things maritime, and they've tried to identify the name of the boat, but the pictures aren't quite clear enough. So it's sort of a mystery of where that boat came from, what they were doing, and what happened to it.
And probably they were sorry they were in the vicinity at the time of the test.
Right, but it seems like they were supposed to be there. Now, there was an incident where they didn't understand the properties, so when they set off the device, it was many times larger than expected. I can't remember, I think the Castle Bravo or something like that. And we're thinking that was possibly caught in there. There's another boat called the Lucky Dragon 5 that's not the boat in the pictures. That's actually in a museum in Japan. The boat in the pictures is an unknown one, we think caught in the same incident. Now, having said that, I wonder if some people in black will come over and quiz me, but still.
It's on your website, so it's been there long enough for people to have discovered it already. Well, I think that for the younger listeners, as I recall, there was a hydrogen bomb test out there, right?
Yes, and it converted lithium to a fissile form when the detonation went off, and it enhanced the explosion considerably.
And it vaporized, the island disappeared, as I recall.
Good chunks of it, yeah. Now it's one of the most popular diving destinations in the world. Sea life has returned. Yeah, sea life has returned. If you're into scuba diving, that's kind of like the Dayton Invention of scuba diving. You need to go to dive on some of those wrecks down there. It's relatively safe to do that.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Oh boy, I've thought about this. I've listened to your podcast for a long time, and I think I've heard things with which I agree, and one of the things I do wonder about that I don't hear mentioned as often is curiosity. Like a lot of people don't seem to care or want to know how their phone works or even aware that their phone is a radio. I somehow can't imagine in my mind somebody having something and not being at least curious how it works. And I think if they're curious about technology or anything in life, they will ask questions and maybe get them involved in knowing more about it. Maybe it's, as I get older, it's me looking jaded at the younger people, wondering is that curiosity gone or is it just directed somewhere else? I mean, it's a tough question to answer about what to do about ham radio. I think the best we can do is lead by example and make ourselves available, which is one of the reasons why I have the blog up. I'm hoping that some other like-minded nerd will read it and discover, hey, I can do this sort of thing. It's as I said before, don't be afraid to fail. You learn more by failing. And these days, you even have more an advantage than I did when I was becoming a ham, because there's any number of ways to go on the Google web and figure out what other people have done or might be able to do. I think there's hope in that, but how do we direct more people, call their attention to ham radio? That is a little bit beyond my purview. I wouldn't say I lay awake at night wondering about how to do that, but that's a question for which there's no one simple answer.
You bring to mind when you talk about curiosity and about don't be afraid to fail is that I think that our society, here's Eric going off on a society tangent, I think that our society doesn't reward people for failure. It only recognizes people who win or get 100%. My wife's a high school teacher, and for some reason all of her kids get at least 85. And I remember being in school, when I was a kid, that there are people that got in the 70s and there are people that got in the 80s, but you can't give a student anything less than a 90 these days. So it seems like there's no rewards for failure.
Right. Yeah, I agree with Bill Mara. He said a number of times on his podcast, learn more by failing, or along those lines, as he recalls the anecdote of buying a radio looking at a radio that doesn't work and paying extra for that, because learning by fixing, you will learn more than just by buying.
Do you have advice for newer returning hams to the hobby?
Absolutely. Join your local club and join more than one of them. Not every club has the same people interested in the same thing. There's more to ham radio than your handy-talkie. There's more to ham radio than digital modes. It's a huge canvas.
I think a lot of people are turned off by their first visit to an amateur radio club, especially if people don't come and welcome them, because they feel like they're interlopers into a new territory that maybe they don't know anything about. What do you think in terms of if you're a new ham and you're not sure what you're interested in? You bought the $25 handy-talkie because the guy, when you took the test, that's what they said, oh, you could get on the air with your technician class license with this. So that's their only exposure to amateur radio to this point.
Well, I guess the question is one of the difficulties we have around here is finding the people that don't know. For example, a lot of people in this area get their ham license for, say, emergency communication, MCOM purposes, but the way it all works is they would never know that there was more to ham radio. And how do you intercept those people somewhere along the line to point them in a direction where there's more you can do with this hobby? There's ham radio is more than talking on a radio. There are occasional hams that cross the line, as it were, and are astounded to know that there's HF, or you can talk over the world without the internet, or there's like field day or something like that. These people, some of the new hams get intercepted before they can see what the rest of the world is like, or lose interest. That's one of the things that our local club has been trying to do is, in addition to the normal ham classes, there's the so-called What Now class. The ARRL used to send out newsletters years ago to all new amateurs explaining what you can do besides just talk on the radio and ham radio. It'd be nice to see that again. I'm not sure how you do it. But in the What Now class, we show things like, mention that there exist things like HF and Moonbounce and microwave and just sideband, things like that.
We need the old PSA, public service announcement.
Yeah, where do you put it, though? Younger kids don't watch appointment TV anymore. Maybe they run across it on YouTube.
Or Facebook buys or something like that.
Right, yeah.
There's so many silos now that people are in that to get to all of them could be difficult. I guess there's the old FCC database.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what the FCC has in mind. Howell, you had him on here a while back, the one that's on the ICQ podcast. I think he has it right when he talks about mining the FCC database to see who's out there, because we have to understand what the problem is like before we can hope to solve it. Knowing who the hams are out there and what they're interested in would seem like a necessary first step.
There is a database I've seen online in North America that shows amateurs by county.
Mm-hmm.
So you could at least find out in your zip code all the hams who have licenses. Maybe that's a place for a local club to mine for prospective members and other hams. Yeah,
it's a matter of doing it. Mailing is expensive, and finding email addresses is... How do you find those people these days? You think it would get easier, but I don't know that it is.
Melissa.com.
Oh, okay.
I'll put that in the show notes. I just spent some money with them cleaning up my email lists.
Okay.
It's worthwhile. Clint, I want to thank you so much for joining me at the QSO Today podcast. I know from your prolific writing that there's probably another 2 or 3 hours here of stuff that we can discuss, but instead I'm going to direct everyone over to your website so that they can at least take a bite and see what it looks like. So with that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
I appreciate it. 73 to you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Clint. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KA7OEI in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.